I invite the member for Nelson Creston to lead the House in prayer or reflection.
Thank you, Speaker. As we open this autumn session, I hope we are filled with gratitude. Gratitude for this beautiful sunny day, gratitude for the water, food, and coffee that nourishes us and keeps us going, gratitude to live in this beautiful province, gratitude for the people we represent, gratitude for our diverse and dynamic communities, gratitude for the staff, both here and at home, for all the work they do, gratitude for each other, and last but not least, gratitude for our incredible families who support us and let us do this work. Today and every day, let's live with gratitude. Thank you.
Members, first of all, welcome to the fall session. Honorable members, for the purposes of the historic record of this place, I wish to acknowledge that today marks the first time that our House is meeting since the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on September 8. Just earlier this year, at the opening of the current session, Her Honor the Lieutenant Governor noted that February 6 marked 70 years since Her late Majesty's accession to the throne, launching a historic Platinum Jubilee year. As members know, our system of parliamentary democracy is rooted in a constitutional monarchy. Her late Majesty was represented by 13 lieutenant governors and 13 premiers of this province served during her reign. In this House, 21 speakers were confirmed in the name of Her late Majesty, and countless bills became law when royal assent was granted in Her late Majesty's name. Last month, I relayed on behalf of all members of this House sincere condolences to members of the royal family and our new sovereign, His Majesty King Charles III. I know that we held Her late Majesty in the highest esteem and will reflect on her life of service for a long time to come. Introduction by members. Member for Surrey Fleetwood.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Visiting us today are a very special guest from India and here in BC. We have with us, Mr. Speaker, Sant Singh Broad, sitting right there, who is visiting us from India. Mr. Broad is well known and a respected farmer, activist, and community leader in Punjab. He has served as a chairperson of Punjab State Cooperative Bank and as a vice chairperson of the National Cooperative Union of India and as a director of Reserve Bank of India. He donated 5 acres of his land to build a regional education center of Punjab University at Muktsar. He's also joined with his wife, Harjeet Kaur, and his son and his wife, Gurjeet Singh Broad and Ramneet Kaur Broad. They live in Nelson, and they are the owner of the famous nursery Geo Rama Growers. Last but not the least, Mr. Speaker, their host, a good friend, Paramjit Singh Khosla, who runs a very successful trucking business in Surrey. So I'll ask the members to please make them feel welcome.
Madam Clerk.
Introduction of bills. Private members' time.
Member for Victoria Beacon Hill. Oh, no, sorry. It's very difficult to say. Vancouver Falls Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Women, life, freedom. Zan, Zendegi, Azadi. October is Women's History Month in BC, and it's celebrated in October in recognition of the Persons Case, when, in 1929, women were first acknowledged as persons under law in Canada. But before I talk about Women's History Month, I want to speak about women making history at this very moment, and the women-led protests that are happening across the world in support of the brave women in Iran who are standing up and fighting against brutal odds for their freedom. for their personhood. Gina Amini, also known as Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian, was detained by the so-called morality police for allegedly leaving some of her hair visible in violation of an Iranian law requiring women to cover their heads. Mahsa Amini was, according to witnesses, severely beaten in a police van and died on September 16th after falling into a coma. This is state-sanctioned, gender-based violence, and the women of Iran and their supporters have had enough. They're putting their lives at risk to demonstrate in the streets, they're burning their headscarves, and they're cutting their hair. This weekend, I participated in an incredible march in Vancouver that ran from the art gallery to the Lionsgate Bridge, and many thousands of Canadian Iranians and their allies raised their voices in unison against the continued state-sanctioned violence against women in Iran, and they chanted, "Women, life, freedom," and say her name, Mahsa Amini. Heartbreakingly, Mahsa is not the first nor the last woman to have been killed by the so-called morality police, but her death has galvanized the populace in a way rarely seen. Mahsa is a Kurdish Iranian, and Kurds are discriminated against in Iran. This tragic and senseless death has brought together segments of Iran from many perspectives, all protesting together for change. Women in Iran and everywhere in the world do not need their bodies policed. They need the freedom to live without violence and fear. They deserve to participate fully in society. All women need this, and when I hear the chant, "We are all Mahsa," I believe it's our common desire for freedom from violence and a desire to live full lives that binds us together. My colleague, the Minister of State for Infrastructure and MLA for North Vancouver Lonsdale, made an important point when we were discussing the protests, which she also attended. She said many of the Iranian Canadians here in BC have close relatives in Iran, and they take a huge risk when they raise their voices publicly against this repressive regime. But we don't. And she's right, and as such, we are not under threat of retaliation. So I say to my non-Iranian friends and colleagues, and especially those of us in government, let's help and add our voices to this important fight. What else can we do to help our Iranian sisters? At the rally, a protester handed me a slip of paper that had been prepared should any elected officials attend, and I want to raise her voice now. Here is what it said. To all democratic governments, Iranians all over the world are protesting the brutality and crimes against humanity of the Islamic regime in Iran. The citizens of Iran have demonstrated that the tyrannical regime is not their legitimate representative, and they want to build a new democracy that is based on human rights. Our request to you is close your embassies in Iran and expel your ambassadors of the Islamic regime from your continents. Expel the Islamic regime from all international organizations. Stop trading with the Islamic regime, and more importantly, stop buying their oil. Stop granting visas to those tied to the regime who directly or indirectly participate in the suppression of Iranian citizens and perpetrations of crimes against humanity. Be on the right side of history. That completes the message handed to me, and I read it because it's the one thing to attend a protest, but the people are asking for real action from leaders all around the world. This is Women's History Month, and real history is being made by the women of Iran and their supporters, and women and allies all over the world who've attended protests in more than 150 international cities, including Auckland, New York, Seoul, Zurich. In Brisbane, Australia, thousands from the Iranian diaspora protested under the slogan, "Be Our Voice." In Tokyo, demonstrators carried photographs of Iranian women burning their headscarves and cutting their hair. But in Iran itself, protests in over 80 cities have been met with an intensifying crackdown, shuttering of the internet to decrease protesters' ability to organize, and estimates are that over 1,200 people have been imprisoned, including more than 20 journalists, and dozens of people have been killed. Artists, filmmakers, athletes, musicians, and actors voiced their support for the protests, even as the Iranian football players wore black tracksuits as their national anthem was played before their match in Vienna. They are also likely remembering Sahar Khodayari, a young woman, Iranian woman, who in 2019 dressed as a man to sneak into a soccer match to see her beloved team play. In being discovered, she was arrested, and rather than going to jail, she killed herself. Yesterday, reports came out of Sharif University that students and staff were reportedly surrounded by armed guards, shot at, and arrested. This is Iran's MIT, the most prestigious engineering school in Iran and the alma mater of many people I know, many people working in the tech industry here in BC. To the women and their allies in Iran, to the students and the professors, and to all Iranian Canadians, please know that we see you. We stand with you. Women, life, freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Member. Member for Richmond North Centre.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And thank you to the member opposite for the opportunity to speak on this important topic, Women's History Month. Having served nearly 10 years as the MLA for Richmond North Centre, I feel a great sense of pride every time I take my place in this House and feel blessed for the opportunity to represent my constituents. Many years ago, there were much fewer women in this chamber, and even fewer women of color and of diverse cultures. I know that my parents were incredibly proud to see what I was able to achieve in my life, first in my career in journalism, and next in my career in politics. And they make many sacrifices to help make my dreams possible. My beloved mother, Chi Nao, passed away 1 week ago today. She dedicated her life to taking the very best care of me and my late sister. She was an extremely intelligent woman and a real people person. She would have thrived in any career, but she chose to be a full-time wife and mother, which I've always been grateful for. Despite her sacrifices, Mom led a very fulfilling and joyful life in Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and Vancouver. Her tireless support and care no doubt helped me achieve my goals and dreams and gave me the skills and confidence to pursue the seat I hold in this House today. She inspires me to offer the same support to women in my community and beyond. It's so important that we lift each other up and help each other succeed. This year marks the 30th anniversary of Women's History Month, and we celebrate the achievements and contributions of women everywhere. This year's theme is, "She did, so now I can." I think of this in two ways. In one way, it fits in perfectly with the story I just described of my mother's selfless sacrifices so that her children could have a better life. In a second way, it also ties into the importance of diversity in our institutions, including this one. That diversity helps women and members of other historically underrepresented groups to see themselves as viable contenders for elected office. If they see someone in the community do it, perhaps they can as well. During Women's History Month, you also honor Canadian women who refuse to accept the status quo, who fought hard for the rights we enjoy today. Of course, there's always more work to be done on issues like equal pay, as BC currently has the worst gender pay gap in Canada at 18.6%. Or issues like gender-based violence, which women, girls, two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people are at highest risk of experiencing. We need a new comprehensive action plan to tackle this serious issue, and we need it as soon as possible. These are just a couple examples of the pressing issues we as legislators must consider and take action on. We know there's always a lot more to do, and it will take all of us working together to achieve it.
Thank you, Member.
We must all make it a priority to think about how we can advance equality in our province and in our communities, and take the action needed so that everyone has opportunity to contribute, to achieve, and to succeed. No one should face exclusion due to race, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, physical ability, language, or immigration status. I call on all members of this House to consider how we might work together to further advance the rights of all women so that we can build a more inclusive province for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member. And of course, Member, we send you love during this difficult time for you and to your family. Member for Vancouver False Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for her very personal and powerful words. Women's History Month in BC takes place in October in commemoration of the Persons case. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, Edwards v. AG of Canada, aka the Persons case, was a constitutional ruling that established the right of women to be appointed to the Senate. The case was initiated by the Famous Five, a group of prominent women activists: Emily Murphy, Henrietta Muir Edwards, Nellie McClung, Louise Crummy McKinney, and Irene Parlby. Never doubt that a small and committed group of people can change history. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. The Persons case opened the door for every one of the women sitting in this legislature here today. And while we are proud to be a democratic province which has made great strides in equality, we still have much work ahead. People who identify as women, people of color, and Indigenous people still make less money than their white male counterparts. People who identify as women still carry an uneven share of domestic work, including childcare. And although we are making strides in more women graduating than ever from college, there are still more men named John as CEOs than the number of female CEOs in total. And for LGBTQIA folks, the numbers are tougher still. We must continue our work to fight sex and gender-based discrimination, and we must ensure that women's work is valued properly, that jobs that women often do are paid fair wages, and that includes reversing privatization that drove so many women into minimum wage jobs. We must continue to properly fund sexual assault centers and support women leaving domestic violence. Supporting the work of organizations helping these folks is paramount. We must continue to lessen the load for LGBTQIA folks by legitimizing their presence and inclusion in society in every way. I am proud to be a member of a government caucus whose majority are women, but I also know that we live in a time where rights are slipping backwards, not continuing forward as one might expect. The recent changes in regard to Roe v. Wade in the US and the changing political climate worldwide reminds us that hard-won rights can be and are being eroded. We must ensure that women are present in the new economy, and I'm particularly worried about research coming out of the US showing the slide backwards of women in tech from 2020 to 2021 by 2.6%. This Women's History Month, As we all celebrate the successes we've gained, let's all commit to doubling down on what needs to happen, both at home and around the world, to ensure equality for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Member for Abbotsford West. Abbotsford South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Abbotsford South.
Mr. Speaker, without transparency, there cannot be true democracy. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise before the House today to discuss the necessity for transparency within British Columbians' governments, and especially for the people's ability to hold their elected representatives responsible and accountable. Unfortunately, recent changes in this very legislation have slowed and eroded away the transparency that British Columbians enjoyed when engaging BC government. Today, British Columbians are served by government which, according to the C.D. Howe Institute, has one of the worst ratings of governmental and fiscal transparency in the entire country. The fact is that when it came to fiscal transparency, BC did not score well on the metrics of timelines, placement of key metrics, reliability, transparency of numbers, or even comparability of numbers. Our province scored a disappointing D grading, a stark decline from the A rating just a few years prior to that. As more and more people are choosing or being forced to choose between food on the table or gas in the car to drive their kids to school, all while being unable to find a family doctor, now more than ever, transparency from government is essential. Mr. Speaker, hard-working British Columbians have questions. Where does their hard-earned taxpayer money end up going? What is it being spent on? Is it being spent appropriately? And is it being spent where it is most needed? Unfortunately, according to experts, British Columbians do not have the answers to those questions. Unless you have support from someone with a lot of time to help go through the governmental documents for you, the everyday British Columbian is left in the dark thanks to the lack of affordable, accessible, and easily understandable transparent information from government. Mr. Speaker, fiscal transparency aside, transparency with how government intends to solve the issues that people are facing is also instrumental for good governance. Let's take the Fraser Valley Highway 1 Corridor Improvement Project as an example. People from my riding in Abbotsford South share the frustrations of thousands of folks that travel through this congested, outdated, overcapacity, and frankly, dangerous stretch of highway that connects the Lower Mainland to the Fraser Valley. The long overdue widening from 264th Street to Watcombe Road is a critical length of highway that proved to be utilized heavily during the BC's flood and resource supply system, has had no public-facing updates since the public consultation ended over a year ago in July of 2021. Mr. Speaker and members of the House, I encourage you to visit the website yourself, Google search it, or even call the office. You will realize very quickly how difficult it is to obtain information from government, regardless of whether it is complex fiscal information or even just an update on your region's transportation infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, we need transparency on where the project is now, what has happened since the consultation ended over a year ago, and at the very least, Mr. Speaker, whether the people in the Fraser Valley can expect to hear anything about where the project is currently. Transparency, accountability, representation, responsibility. These are all words that are alive and well in BC political rhetoric. However, these words will continue to remain nothing but buzzwords for as long as they go unacted upon. No transparency doesn't always mean low grades like the D rating. You can get awards as well. Not really a cause worth celebrating, Mr. Speaker, but the Canadian Association of Journalists awarded government with the Outstanding Achievement in Government Secrecy Award in 2021. Quote, the BC's government's bold efforts to significantly walk back transparency legislation has undermined freedom of the press and the public's ability to monitor the provincial government's actions. End of quote. This is from a board member of the Canadian Association of Journalists. What more evidence do we need to realize that we have a serious problem with transparency in government? Here's another one, Mr. Speaker. The BC Union of Indian Chiefs has said in an open letter that the introduction of fees for Freedom of Information requests about government activities would disproportionately impact low-income requesters, including First Nations seeking to substantiate land claims and land-related grievances. That's a reference to the controversial and, I have to say, bewildering $10 fee that was implemented as a barrier to obtaining information from government through the amendments to the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. Despite all the reasoning, Mr. Speaker, given for government's intent to pass legislation, there remains one undeniable fact, and that is it has only made requesting information from government more costly, more bureaucratic, and overall more difficult for average British Columbians. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat and wait to hear from the member in response. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Member for Maple Ridge Mission.
Well, thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. And thanks very much for the member from Abbotsford South for bringing this, this issue up. What he's saying is simply not true. I mean, in fact, BC is committed to transparency and openness in regards to government records. The Ministry of Citizen Services is actually improving FOI systems so that people can timely access information they need and can respond, and so the ministry can respond quickly to complex and high volume requests. And in fact, this past year alone, Honourable Speaker, the ministry processed nearly 2 million pages of records for response to FOI requests, and 1 million pages have already been processed this year to date. That's transparency in action, Honourable Speaker. The number of proactive disclosures, that means disclosures that come out without any request, has increased by 75% since 2017. This means that this information is available to everyone for free. And this includes ministerial budget estimate binders. And if anyone's seen them, they're massive. And that contains a wealth of detailed information on each ministry budget line by line, completely open to the public at no charge. Significantly more transparent government. Now, in fact, prior to 2017, Honourable Speaker, there were a few transparency issues in this government. And that included things like a critical report on ICBC, where pages were actually removed. And these may have shone a light on the dumpster fire that was extinguished after 2017. Or the very well-known triple delete scandal that involved deleting emails concerning the Highway of Tears after an FOI request. Now, under this new legislation, Honourable Speaker, actions like this might be subject to up to a $50,000 fine. So these are actual consequences for willfully hiding information subject to FOI. That improves transparency, Honourable Speaker. Now, recent amendments to the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act permit public bodies to charge an application fee of $10 for general, non-personal requests. And this came into effect November 26, 2021. Now, it's very important, Honourable Speaker, that people requesting their own personal information continue to pay no fee. And unlike what the member on the other side was saying, Indigenous governing entities require no fee. So, once again, we're getting a little bit of misinformation from the other side. The $10 fee is only for non-personal FOI requests that, and this is in line with other jurisdictions, nominal fee, and it's modest. This fee encourages applications as well to be specific. Now, I assure the member from Abbotsford South would prefer the older fishing expedition type of regime that happened before 2017, and they would love to continue to search in vain for scandals, but we have made very significant changes to update FOI in this province. Under the previous legislation, people waited far too long, Honourable Speaker. There's a very small number of requesters really clogged up the system, and we've been dealing with that. The government is committed to providing access to information that people deserve as quickly as possible, Honourable Speaker. And with this implementation of the fee, Honourable Speaker, the government has seen a reduction in the broad multi-ministerial requests, and so they can better focus on the requests that people are asking for specific information. And there's been no indication so far that this new fee has provided any barrier, Honourable Speaker, to people making requests to FOI. However, the Ministry is, of course, looking and monitoring this fee structure to make sure that we have transparent government. So this government is improving services to delivery. It's transparent, and including British Columbians who are waiting for access for their free personal information, and improving and increasing proactive disclosure of information. Honourable Speaker, this government is committed to transparency. We're delivering on that, and I appreciate what the other member is saying. However, I can say that people are getting their freedom of information requests faster, and that is exactly what we're after. Thanks, Honourable Speaker.
Abbotsford South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the member opposite for his comments, and on much of that we'll agree to disagree. I'm sure we can agree, Mr. Speaker, that government transparency helps engage more British Columbians with a system of governance that has left them feeling unsupported in recent times. This is not just in British Columbia. I would say, Mr. Speaker, that this goes across the country, in fact. Allowing the public easy access to information that is presented in a digestible, truthful, and factful manner will only help this House better understand the people it serves. Encouraging discourse, instead of making it more difficult for people, only allows decision makers to make more informed and consultation-based decisions. The people of Abbotsford South, for instance, Mr. Speaker, should not have to wait for over a year to hear the next update on their highway widening project from the government. Neither should the student learning to become an investigative journalist have to pay to request information from their government. We don't need more barriers, Mr. Speaker. We don't need more barriers between the government and the people it has sworn to serve. We need these barriers torn down, replaced with more transparency. The D rating for fiscal transparency, the Outstanding Achievement in Government Secrecy Award, and many calls for access to information are things that we should not be proud of. They are things that we should identify as a wrong direction and correct our course. I encourage the members of this legislature to live up to the values of transparency, accountability, and responsibility. They are expected from us as elected representatives. We should all be in agreement on that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, member. Member for Richmond, Steveston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to talk about Buy BC. Buy BC is awesome. It supports local food producers, it gets fresh, locally made food into the hands of enthusiastic customers, such as myself, and grows our local economy. Our government relaunched Buy BC in 2017, and since then, an investment of $10 million has generated over $80 million of sales of good quality food and beverages across the province. The Buy BC program is great for generating awareness in consumers that they're choosing an option that supports local businesses and workers. This grows the size of the market, creates a win for producers, but also a win for consumers who can access excellent products in just about every category. Did you know that over 3,400 products currently use the Buy BC logo, and that represents hundreds of BC companies? The Buy BC logo is also free for BC companies to use, and they get the benefit of province-wide brand recognition, which increases their domestic sales. It's such a recognizable and desirable brand that grocery stores are happy to partner to promote BC products in store. Sobeys, Thrifty Foods, Safeway, and Save On Foods feature great local food and beverages at over 70 grocery stores in 40 communities. That's a mighty reach for delicious BC products and a great way to help build success and opportunities to scale up. Strengthening local food systems is also good for people and the economy, and it's also good for climate policy. Shorter supply chains mean less GHGs and more resilience when faced with challenges. And we've seen a lot of those challenges lately: fires, flooding, pandemic, just to name a few. But supporting local products improves BC's food security, because we don't have to rely as much on agricultural products from California or stock up on snacks from the US's East Coast. Our local food systems are important. That's why Buy BC is also partnering with almost 150 farmers markets and engaging the public with local food literacy activities. Education helps motivate consumers to purchase local products, which grows demand and improves our food security. Education also encourages business-to-business sales growth, where Buy BC connects farmers and processors with retailers, restaurants, and distributors to increase the availability and consumption of local products. Industry-led marketing promotions support the ability of BC farmers, processors, and farmers markets to increase the consumer awareness and sales of the registered local products. And with Buy BC province-wide advertising campaigns, broad support for local farmers and processors has increased. We've created more opportunities for business growth. Buy BC is a strong and recognizable brand that promotes consumer confidence and helps identify local food and drink for consumers. Consumers know that when they buy local, they're supporting local businesses and their local communities. An incredible 90% of consumers feel that Buy BC is important to their local community, and 85% say Buy BC makes it easier to identify local products in stores across the province. Combined with the visibility of Buy BC advertising in BC, that's resulted in overwhelming demand from retailers such as Sobeys, who are looking for opportunities to increase their local food offerings and partner on Buy BC retail promotions. And partnering in all things is the key to success. A key component of Buy BC is the Buy BC Partnership Program. Every year, this $2 million popular program is fully subscribed. It provides eligible businesses with cost-shared funding to deliver local marketing activities using the Buy BC logo on their products or promotional materials that helps consumers easily identify their product as a BC product. Buy BC has helped hundreds of local businesses increase their sales and share local products with British Columbians through the use of the Buy BC logo on thousands of BC products. Combined with funding for over 300 industry-led marketing campaigns and thousands of Buy BC signs in 79 grocery stores. And the ministry is always looking for new ways to create additional opportunities to help promote and sell more local food. This past year, Buy BC initiatives have included retail partnerships with major retailers like chain grocery stores, which increases the visibility and demand for local products. There's also an annual networking event called Every Farmer Needs a Chef, Every Chef Needs a Farmer, to strengthen that relationship between chefs and farmers so that we can grow the strength of our food system and demonstrate the value of locally sourced food and beverages. The Buy BC Chef Ambassador Initiative promotes the importance of buying local to consumers. Again, part of the outreach on the importance and benefits of buying local. Part of looking for new ways to create opportunity for local business is being adaptive to changing conditions. That's why the Buy BC e-commerce program was launched with $550,000 of one-time funding in 2020 as part of the COVID-19 response. This program helped farmers and food and beverage processors pivot their sales models so that they could develop and market online sales. The marketplace is changing, even for food and beverage producers. And it's important to support a digital transition for industries that traditionally rely on in-person sales. Buy BC products are delicious and great for our local economy and food security. I know I'm not the only one who looks for locally produced food and drinks because I know they're going to be great and support our community. People get excited about local food. Buy BC is a natural partner to help folks find their way to their next great find that they'll share with their family and friends. Food brings people together, and Buy BC is an important part of helping make that happen with fantastic local products.
Thank you, Member. Member for Delta South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Speaker, it's a pleasure to rise in the House today on the opening day of the fall sitting to speak on a topic of great personal interest to me, buying local. We all know the economic, social, and environmental benefits of doing so. When we spend our hard-earned dollars on local goods, we put those dollars into the hands of our friends and neighbours who have worked equally hard to produce high-quality goods for our enjoyment. Buying local keeps those dollars in our community, producing many spin-off benefits, including job creation and improved public infrastructure. It also feels good to support local entrepreneurs and business owners, to interact with them personally at a farmer's market or in their storefront to learn more about their goods and how they were produced. Many of these operations are family-owned and operated and have spanned generations. So for those who are interested in true farm-to-table experiences, who want those high-quality and delicious locally grown products featured in their meals, the Buy BC program is a great place to start. You can look for the Buy BC symbol in your local grocery store, as it helps to promote a wide range of agriculture, food, and beverage products. This free marketing tool also helps BC producers and processors get the word out about their exceptional goods. And it's those people I want to focus on for a moment, Mr. Speaker, the farmers, the ranchers, the growers, the processors, and the producers. The ones keeping a constant eye on the weather, on their many expenses, trying to predict how they will fare each season. The ones taking all the risks involved with their planting on time, harvesting on time, weather, frost, heat, disease, and livestock health. The ones still recovering from last year's record high temperatures, blazing wildfires, and an atmospheric river that devastated many farms and ranches. Honourable Speaker, if the rest of us want to keep buying local, we need to ensure these folks are being supported beyond the purchases that we make at the grocery store. And we have seen a tremendous movement towards agritourism and on-farm sales. Let's take berries, for instance, that used to go to a jam processing plant. Now we're seeing farm day trip experiences for city folks who have an on-farm blueberry sundae, a strawberry milkshake, or a raspberry ice cream cone. Combining all this with hay rides, petting zoos, live music, and direct retail sales of homegrown meats and vegetables. These on-farm activities should absolutely be encouraged, not frowned upon by government. It's imperative that government be there for them, supporting them in their efforts to remain viable, particularly in the most challenging times. And Honourable Speaker, times have been challenging indeed. Not just for consumers who find themselves doing a double take at their grocery store as costs for food continue to rise due to inflation and other factors, but for farmers who are also dealing with skyrocketing costs and the many impacts on their bottom line. I've spoken before in this House about some of their main concerns, whether it's the employer's health tax, routine increases to British Columbia's minimum wage, increased carbon taxes without revenue neutrality, rising fuel prices, or higher insurance premiums. They're also currently dealing with the rising costs of the 3 F's in agriculture: feed, fuel, and fertilizer. To help alleviate some of this burden, I have called for the financial incentives and tax relief for farmers. I believe there are several measures that would make life more affordable for farmers in the future and help those currently struggling to turn a profit. We also know that the challenges facing farmers aren't strictly monetary. I have been outspoken about the fact our province is experiencing a veterinarian shortage. Existing veterinarians are experiencing burnout, and newly credentialed veterinarians are not choosing to take their desperately needed skills to rural parts of British Columbia. We need to be innovative in our approach to this shortage. I believe we could start by providing certainty to students attending the Western College of Veterinary Medicine in Saskatoon that the additional spaces allocated to them will continue to be funded past the 2020-23 school year. These are just some ideas to further support the industry so that we can all continue to buy local now and well into the future. We must ensure that these hardworking individuals and families can continue to stay in business and pass on their operations to the next generation. We know how important it is to protect farmers today, but also future generations of farmers. I know that's a big priority for the Minister of Agriculture, one that I applaud as a third-generation dairy farmer myself. Honourable Speaker, I thank the member opposite for giving me the opportunity to not only highlight the Buy BC program and the many benefits of buying local, but also to shine a light on the many affordability challenges farmers are facing, which ultimately get passed on to consumers, as we know. Helping farmers manage their cost to turn helps keep prices affordable for people who do want to buy local in this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Member for Richmond-Steveston.
And I want to thank the member for his enthusiasm on local agriculture and local food. I'm always very excited to talk about food. You may have noticed. Buy BC supports over 300 producers, processors, cooperatives, agricultural fairs, farmers markets, and associations with marketing activities that generated approximately $80 million in total sales from a total government investment of $10 million. Buy BC is a province-wide marketing program led by the Ministry of Agriculture and is focused on building greater consumer awareness, demand, and sales of local agriculture and food and beverage products within BC. Buy BC has helped hundreds of local businesses increase their sales and share local products with British Columbians. Grateful British Columbians. To date, Buy BC has enabled over 750 companies to register for logo use, to promote over 3,400 BC products, funded over 300 industry-led marketing campaigns, and displayed over 10,000 Buy BC signs in 79 grocery stores. Examples of local businesses that Buy BC has supported include the Squamish Water Kefir Company, which produces fermented drinks. They used Buy BC to promote their business and introduce buyers and consumers to a new product line. This allowed them to create a marketing campaign that they otherwise would not have been able to implement and reach the audience that they needed to reach real growth and success. Little Creek Dressing produces small batch artisan salad dressings in Kelowna, and it promoted its products by using the Buy BC logo on point-of-sale items and promotional materials, along with a very clever online advertising campaign. Sheringham Distillery Limited in Souk on southern Vancouver Island incorporated the Buy BC logo onto labels of its locally made vodka and gin, and delivered print and social media ad campaigns to help identify its product in the BC marketplace. Buy BC allowed them to free up capital to create new product lines, as well as target more territories with added marketing materials. To find out more information about the program, visit the Buy BC website at buybc.gov.bc.ca or follow Buy BC on social media at Eat, Drink, Buy BC. So whether you grow apples, make specialty baking, or are just hungry, remember, Buy BC.
Thank you, Member. Member for Kootenay East.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'm grateful to rise today and welcome everybody back after an enjoyable summer and this first day of the fall session. I rise this morning to speak to an issue of growing concern throughout communities across the province. As we all know, BC's healthcare system continues to deteriorate with regular hospital closures, understaffed UPCCs, rising wait times, people dying waiting for ambulances, and still nearly 1 million British Columbians are without access to a family doctor, including this MLA from Kootenay East. And rural communities are bearing the brunt of this crisis. Every part of our healthcare system is in crisis, and fixing our primary care system must be a priority. Our communities continue to suffer, with residents feeling as though nothing is being done to address the situation. Amid this crisis, urgent and primary care centres, or UPCCs, are dubbed as the solution. But unfortunately for British Columbians, UPCCs are also facing major staffing shortages and failing to meet the healthcare needs of residents in their areas. This is happening while hospitals across British Columbia are undergoing major diversions as they grapple with staffing issues. There is nowhere in this province, it seems, that is untouched by this issue. Communities are not only struggling with low levels of physicians, nurses, and midwives, but also finding inadequate patient transport from their communities to larger centres. Emergency rooms are frequently closed as they are overwhelmed and understaffed, and communities facing tremendous problems calling ambulances for emergencies where they end up facing long waiting times that have now proven to be fatal. Just 2 weeks ago, a resident of New Westminster suffered a stroke. They were forced to wait an hour for an ambulance despite living just minutes away from the hospital. She is now partially paralyzed. Paramedic shortages are largely affecting ambulance response times, as smaller teams are now forced to cover an even larger area. This forces ambulances to have to travel large distances between calls, which can create delays when they are so far apart. Clearwater Emergency Room, the site of the province's most frequent closures, has often been operating with half the registered nurses needed for a full shift coverage. Many staff members are coming in early and staying late to ensure they can keep their doors open as much as possible. Advocates for healthcare in small communities have said for far too long the wants and needs of residents have been ignored. Rural hospitals are particularly vulnerable to shortages, as just one staff member calling in sick is enough to shut down an emergency room entirely. Now, Honourable Speaker, I will always give credit where credit's due, and I do want to bring to attention the recent announcement of some extra paramedics for the City of Sparwood in my riding of Kootenay East. So I give thanks on behalf of myself and Mayor Wilkes for these extra resources. I've been asking for these much-needed resources along with Mayor Wilkes for many years, and it's good to finally have the support that we need. But this is merely the tip of the iceberg, Mr. Speaker. Like most other communities, Elkford, a half-hour trip up the road from Sparwood, has some serious issues. This mining community of close to 3,000, which has the largest mines in the province in their backyard and that houses 4,000 workers, are in dire need. Honourable Speaker, anniversaries are generally a time to reflect and celebrate. However, in the East Kootenays on September 29th, the thriving community of Elkford had the sad occasion of marking the one-year anniversary of the temporary closure of the Elkford Emergency Department. 1 year and counting in a heavy industrial town with no hope in sight. This is unacceptable and continues to create dire situations in our part of the province. Recently, a senior resident fell and severely broke his leg. Calling the ambulance dispatcher, he was told the wait time was at least 30 minutes. Not sure what to do, he called my office hoping he would be able to provide him with some assistance getting an ambulance. Upon getting in contact with the dispatcher, the timeline had now become an hour wait. The resident simply could not withstand the pain and lengthy wait, deciding to drive himself to the hospital with a broken leg. This elderly citizen, having to take himself to the hospital with such a severe injury, is indicative of the state of our emergency response crisis. And I can't imagine to tell you the safety issues that this would pose with an elderly citizen with a broken leg driving himself down an industrial neighborhood, and what that could pose as a problem not only to himself but other people on the highway. It is clear there is a cascading failure in our healthcare system, and the first responders who are on the front lines are sounding the alarm. In many communities where ambulance shortages are so severe, firefighters are now being stretched thin because they are responding to medical calls. They consistently aid in calls that paramedics and ambulances can't immediately attend to, which ties up their resources even further. Many of the firefighters responding to these calls are also volunteer firefighters who may not be fully trained or equipped to deal with more complex medical emergencies. Over the summer, there were 2 instances in Ashcroft that, due to the extended ambulance response time, tragically ended with 2 lost lives. In the most recent situation, after the ambulance was unable to reach the person suffering from a heart attack for at least 30 minutes, firefighters were called. Unfortunately, they were all volunteers and not trained as medical first responders, but tried their best to aid the person suffering. The Mayor of Ashcroft highlighted how this is also causing concern, as for many rural communities, it is already difficult finding volunteer firefighters. The now added expectation of having to step in for ambulances as emergency response has the potential to deter people from joining and force others out. This crisis is clearly an incredibly layered issue with failures happening on all different levels. Our emergency rooms are understaffed and overrun, struggling to handle capacity and often closed in rural areas with little staff. Our ambulance services are struggling to keep up with demand, covering large areas and working as hard as possible in an impossible situation. It is time to listen to our communities across the province and take immediate action to relieve pressures on our emergency response teams and ensure there's not a single additional avoidable death. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Member for North Coast.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the member for raising this important issue that is not just relevant to the challenges we're facing in healthcare in British Columbia, but Canada-wide and internationally, we are experiencing a healthcare shortage. People are recruiting healthcare workers from all over, and we're all in competition with each other to retain and to attract and to retain these healthcare workers. I too come from a rural community and understand the challenges that he's raised with healthcare for rural communities. In 2013, I was appointed by the current health minister, the leader of the day, to be the Northern and Rural Health Critic. So the issues that this member raises have been long-standing since even before my time becoming health critic. But of course, that was much more highlighted for me as I carried out my work as the Northern Rural Health Critic, which I traveled across the province and I visited many rural communities to talk about the challenges, particularly around maternal health, facing rural communities. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that the stories that he's shared, they are, they're deeply troubling stories, and I'm quite empathetic to the pain and the challenges that people face, particularly in those rural communities that he's mentioned. But these messages of needing more health support are not going unheeded. And in fact, just, a week ago, a few days ago, our Minister of Health released our Health Human Resources Strategy, which is quite a robust strategy to actually address the issues that he's just raised. For example, we're going to be expanding the scope of practice for pharmacists and paramedics. So pharmacists will now actually be able to prescribe certain medications, including providing renewals for up to 2 years. Particularly those that don't have a family doctor, we know how challenging this can be to get a prescription renewal. Sometimes we have to go to the emergency department, which is not a good use of resources. So by expanding their scope of practice and allowing them to fulfill, standard or common prescriptions, this is actually addressing some of the challenges that we're facing. We're also recognizing the credentials for foreign-trained workers. There's a lot of red tape for foreign-trained healthcare workers to practice their particular trade or training in, not just in British Columbia, but in Canada. So we've been streamlining that process to make it easier and quicker to get foreign-trained healthcare workers employed in our community. We've got new training programs to actually train healthcare workers on the job. We have free education for anyone who wants to be a healthcare assistant. Free education. We're putting in strategies to make healthcare centers and hospitals much more culturally appropriate and safer. We're increasing the doctor training spaces at UBC for 2023. That'll be 88 new training positions for physicians. And we're implementing, or we're just undertaking a new strategy to actually create a training program at SFU, or Simon Fraser University. We are putting together a pool of nurses that can be deployed to rural and remote communities. We're increasing the access to virtual healthcare, which is critical for our rural communities. And it has really stepped up the game as far as our ability to get specialized care for those of us that live in these faraway communities. And we're increasing the support for family doctors. So we are assisting doctors right now for the next few months on supporting some of their overhead costs for them to actually continue staying in operation for family practice in their clinics. We know the overhead costs are really expensive, and with the rising cost of living right now, they're facing a huge challenge. So these are just some of the things that we're addressing to combat the challenges we're facing for healthcare, emergency response, and particularly for servicing rural and remote communities. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Recognizing the member for Kootenay East.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Madam Speaker, access to primary care is essential. However, far too many people do not have family doctors and face absurd wait times for care. British Columbians are tired. Last month, our province was shaken as a worst-case scenario came to reality when an 8-month-old infant from Barrier died from an ambulance that failed to arrive in time. This is an absolute tragedy, one that must be avoided at all costs in the future. Our province's ambulance services are majorly understaffed, especially in rural areas, leaving few ambulances to cover significant areas. In this tragic case, the nearest ambulance was dispatched in Kamloops, which is 64 kilometers from Barrier. It is completely unreasonable to expect one crew to be able to travel such distances and respond to calls in an immediate manner. This expectation has led to firefighters stepping in on calls when ambulances are too far away to respond to, stretching out their resources even more. Another tragic situation that happened to a good friend of mine and his son, and I will just read to you what he wrote me. Quote, "Dear Tom, on December 26, while visiting my family in Briscoe, my son suffered a head injury during a sledding accident. I rushed him to Invermere and begged them to dispatch a helicopter from Calgary," which, if some people don't know, is probably not even a half-hour flight time. It was explained to me that the bureaucracy between Alberta and BC Stars Ambulance did not allow for the helicopter to come land. We then transported my son to Cranbrook by ambulance, where again a helicopter would not come, and 4 hours later he was transported by an airplane that had to come from Kelowna first. Unfortunately, my son passed away due to the blood that built up on his brain despite all efforts to drain and relieve the pressure. There was a physician in Alberta immediately that could have taken care of this. I can't help but think, had the helicopter been dispatched from Calgary hours prior, that there would have been a chance to better serve him and save his life," unquote. Madam Speaker, this is simply unacceptable, and now the only thing this father has left is a feeling of what if, and a $4,600 bill from BC Ambulance Services for the delayed transport to Calgary. We must all ensure the well-being of people in British Columbia is front of mind in this legislature, and we must act swiftly to avoid any further avoidable healthcare disasters. Until doctors and healthcare workers are being listened to and real steps are taken to get more people attached to primary care providers, every part of our system will remain under pressure. It's time for action to train, recruit, properly compensate, and retain our healthcare workers and emergency responders. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Government House Leader.
Honourable Speaker, I ask that the House consider proceeding with motion number 14, standing in the name of the member for Chilliwack-Kent.
Members, unanimous consent of the House is required to proceed to motion 14 without disturbing the priorities of the motions preceding it on the order paper. If any member is opposed to the request for leave, please indicate now. Leave has been granted. I recognize the member for Chilliwack-Kent to move the motion.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I am honoured to rise and move the motion, be it resolved that this House commit to advancing the rights of women, girls, trans, gender diverse and two-spirit people, and building an inclusive province for all. At a moment in time where we see gender-based discrimination, threats and violence across the world, across the border, and throughout our own country, there is no excuse for not speaking up and calling out the rhetoric, threats, violence, as loudly as those who have been emboldened or even encouraged to spread this gender-based hate and discrimination. Lives are at stake. livelihoods, safety, education, bodily autonomy, participation, access to services, representation. All at stake when we talk about the rights of women, girls, trans, gender diverse, and two-spirit people. More than half of the people in our province are impacted by what is happening right now. This is not niche, and we know it's not new. But when I speak with people in my community, they describe to me that what does feel new is the growing sense of danger as we collectively witness the entitlement, anger, and freedom felt by some to spread hate, to threaten, intimidate, injure, harass, and otherwise harm based on misogynistic and patriarchal systems and beliefs. A thicker skin and a smile don't protect against what's happening right now. What about our next generation? Will women, girls, trans, gender diverse, and two-spirit people feel confident in stepping into roles like journalist, teacher, politician? Will they put their hands up to represent their communities because they feel safe to do so, or despite the fear after watching what happens? It's questions like this that should crystallize for us how critical it is that not only that we do the work necessary for gender equity in the workforce, but how essential it is that we all focus on ensuring that our kids are learning and developing in an education system that supports our success. This is why I was so proud last month, in the midst of yet more discriminatory fear and anger-based rhetoric and misinformation, to read the joint statement made by the Minister of Education and Childcare and K-12 education partners on support for sexual orientation and gender identity. It's so important, so I will read it now. We know that each child expresses themselves in their own unique way, and some have been bullied and ostracized in the past. All of BC's provincial education partners for K-12 schools, public and independent, are standing together in solidarity to ensure every school is a place where all students deserve to be welcomed, included, and respected in a safe learning environment while being fully and completely themselves. No student should be excluded or bullied because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. In 2016, the BC Human Rights Code was amended to ensure that gender identity and expression are protected under the code. There is no room for any type of discrimination in our schools. As provincial education partners, we stand together in this commitment. All 60 school districts, independent and First Nation schools, have SOGI-inclusive codes of conduct and policy in place, and many are participants in the BC SOGI Educator Network. We have joined collaboratively with ARC Foundation and 11 education and community partner groups to form the Provincial K-12 SOGI Collaborative, officially committing to creating learning environments that are safe, respectful, and welcoming for all BC students. BC's K-12 curriculum includes a focus on valuing diversity and respecting differences, as well as human rights and responses to discrimination. Students deserve to have the complete support of teachers, administrators, support staff, trustees, parents, guardians, caregivers, and their community, as well as we work together to create learning environments where all students are free from discrimination so they can thrive and succeed in their school years and beyond, end quote. Honourable Speaker, I know that our government will continue to do the work on gender equity and look forward to the canvassing of all of these actions in the comments to come. I also look forward to hearing from the opposition responses to this motion. And not only in correcting the horrible record on women set by the BC Liberals, a record of hacking at services for those most vulnerable, cutting funding and wages for women, scrapping the Human Rights Tribunal, and a culture that delivered at best a confusing, inconsistent, and harmful position on gender equity among members. But I also look forward to real commitment to working together to advance the rights of women, not an attempt to justify, not a list of how many women people know. Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I look very forward to the next comments.
Thank you, Member. Recognizing the member for Kelowna Mission.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to speak on this important topic that the member opposite has brought forward today. It is one, I'm sure, that all members of this House can wholeheartedly endorse. We all want to see a more inclusive BC. We all want to create a more equitable society where people are not discriminated against or disadvantaged on the basis of their gender identity. We know that women and gender diverse people have historically been, and in many ways still continue to be, discriminated against in our province. Yet we've made some significant strides over the past century, especially in the last few decades. The year that I was born was the first year that women could have a credit rating on their own without a man. This was needed in order to qualify for loans, a credit card, without a male signatory. We've come a long way in just my lifetime, but we have so much farther to go. Let's start with the first step. Admit we have a problem. It's important to admit and acknowledge the fact that we do not live in a truly equitable, inclusive society, and that women and gender-diverse British Columbians need action. Which brings me to my next step: act. To not just talk or promise to make a change, but to make it happen. Something that this NDP government has failed to show us so far because they're very stuck in step one. The members opposite like to style themselves the champions of women and gender-diverse people in BC, but their actions have not lived up to their lofty rhetoric. Let's bring up some more facts. The NDP has promised repeatedly to bring in equal pay legislation. Years later, 6 years later, under this NDP government, BC has become one of the last surviving members of a club we do not want to be in. One of 4 remaining provinces without pay equity and transparency legislation in this country. Embarrassing. To make matters worse, we've also the worst gender pay gap in Canada at 18.6%. And what has been done by this government? Nothing. Madam Speaker, as a member of the Select Standing Committee on Finance, we heard from multiple organizations representing women begging for action rather than the lip service that they have received over these past 6 years. My former colleague, the previous member for Surrey South, introduced pay equity legislation 5 times in this House, and this NDP government refused to adopt it every single time. The Premier even went so far as to call this much-needed legislation a political stunt. From a government that professes to care about equality and advancing the rights of women, this behavior is absolutely hypocritical and shameful. Pay equity is not even the only example that we have of this government making a promise to advance equity and failing to follow through. Because we cannot forget that the NDP also promised 6 years ago to make contraception free for all. Free contraception is a matter of fairness. In fact, one person speaking in favor of the policy said, and I quote, "For too long, the cost of contraception has fallen disproportionately on the backs of women, trans, and non-binary people. It's time to make contraception free for all," unquote. It's a sentiment I absolutely agree with. But it might surprise the members in this House, especially the Minister of State for Childcare, because it was her that said it from 2 full years ago. So where is the free contraception British Columbians were counting on this government to deliver? Where is the Minister of State for Childcare, who repeatedly professed the importance of this policy? Where is the action? If it was important then, it should be even more important now. British Columbian women and gender-diverse folks are dealing with increased costs of living, having to choose between rent, food, or medications. They have worse living conditions now than back then. And yet, year after year, budget after budget, there has been no funding for free contraception. Every turn, the NDP have failed to make good on their promises, and as a result, have failed to make needed progress on the path of having a more inclusive BC, leaving women and gender-diverse British Columbians in the dark. Now is the time for action, for tangible steps that make a real difference in the lives of British Columbians. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Surrey Fleetwood.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I stand in this House today, Madam Speaker, to support the motion introduced by the Honourable Member from Chilliwack, Kent, that this House commit to advancing the rights of women, girls, trans, gender-diverse, and two-spirit people, and building an inclusive province for all. Honourable Speaker, everyone has the right to feel safe, respected, and included in their community. Gender equity means people of all genders and gender expressions are treated fairly and have the same opportunities. Our government, Madam Speaker, is committed to helping people achieve what they need to be successful. Every day, in everything we do. Honorable Speaker, the previous government has completely failed to do it. For 16 years, Madam Speaker, BC Liberals cut programs and services designed to help women facing gender-based bias, violence, and discrimination. They scrapped the pay equity legislation, Madam Speaker, and Human Rights Tribunal eliminated the Ministry of Women's Equality. That's what they did. They eliminated funding for BC's 37 women's centers dedicated to help rape and domestic violence victims, and the list goes on. Madam Speaker, BC Liberals' cuts to these programs, combined with the couple of years of pandemic, have impacted lives of women in this province. Women were disproportionately affected by the economic challenges of the pandemic and carried a disproportionate amount of responsibility for homeschooling and caregiving when services were interrupted. Indigenous women, women of color, immigrant women, two-spirit, non-binary people, and women with disability. Excuse me. Disproportionately experience gender-based harassment, violence, and discrimination. According to the Canadian General Social Service in 2014, women are more than 7 times likely to report sexual assault than men. Indigenous women 3.5 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to experience violence. 2S LGBTQ+ individuals are more than 2 times more likely to be a victim of violence. Excuse me. I hope I go through this. And the list goes on. Our government, Madam Speaker, is fixing the damage done by BC Liberals, and that's why we are focusing on removing systemic barriers and taking some of the biggest challenges. Our ongoing recovery from the pandemic and climate-related disaster must be rooted in equity. Where opportunities are available to all people regardless of their gender, ethnicity, or other part of their identity. Our investment in childcare, Madam Speaker, will help parents, especially women, build good lives for their families and pursue their careers. More women than ever will have a safe place to go as we move forward with the major investments in transition homes for women and children leaving violence. We are opening doors for women to pursue their dreams and bring down barriers for women in trade, technology, and other and other non-traditional roles with employment and skill training programs. We continue to raise the minimum wage to help bring equity and fairness for workers. 60% of these workers are women. BC went from one of the lowest minimum wage in Canada under BC Liberals to the highest among provinces under our government. And we are moving forward with plans to introduce pay transparency legislation, a first in BC. Together, Madam Speaker, we will use the opportunities before us to advance equity and everyone's right to live free from discrimination and violence to build a better future for women, girls, two-spirit, and non-binary people in British Columbia. Therefore, I fully support the motion introduced by the honourable member from Chilliwack, Kent. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for West Vancouver, Capilano.
Madam Speaker, thank you. I can't decide if I'm using these or not, so we'll try without. I am pleased to support the member's motion that this House commit to advancing the rights of women, girls, trans, gender diverse and two-spirits people, and building an inclusive province for all. I've seen in my own lifetime, Madam Speaker, advances for women, their economic independence and their ability to choose their own path in life. But more work needs to be done, and it will take generations for women and men to unlearn the expectations that society has historically placed on people due to their gender. In 1970, the Royal Commission on the Status of Women proposed a national child care plan, stating that the care of children is a responsibility to be shared by the mother, the father, and society. And unless this shared responsibility is acknowledged and assumed, women cannot be afforded true equality. Yet BC's current child care system is far from adequate to deliver the universal child care that the NDP government promised in 2017. Despite receiving money from the federal government, the NDP is hoarding those funds and those surpluses instead of making retroactive payments to all parents with children in licensed childcare like they're doing in the province of Ontario. Now, 5 years, almost 6 years since the NDP promise, less than 35% of families who need childcare will see a fee reduction, and just 10% of spaces required will be $10 a day spaces. In fact, childcare fees are higher today than when the NDP government came in over 5 years ago. Toddler fees in Surrey have increased 22%. Preschool fees in Richmond are up 30%. So women's equality can't become a reality without universal childcare. The government has an important role to play in advancing women's rights and empowering them to be equal participants in the workforce and the economic and social process. NDP delays in implementing universal childcare are still holding women back in this province. And, Madam Speaker, childcare, child rearing, we know it primarily falls to women. This is also a significant contributor to the gender equity pay gap. When a woman stays home to be with her child and steps out of the workforce while her counterparts continue to work, she falls further and further behind in pay equity. The BC Liberals' Equal Reporting Act has been introduced 5 times in this House by former MLA Stephanie Kiadu, and it enables pay transparency so both employees and the general public can see where the pay gaps are and ultimately act on that. So why is the NDP ignoring this proposed legislation over and over? BC is one of the only provinces without pay equity and transparency legislation. It has the worst gender pay gap in Canada at 18.5%, according to Statistics Canada, and BC received a C grade on providing economic security for women in West Coast Leaf's Gender Equality Report Card, in part due to its lack of pay equity legislation. There have also been increasing rates of domestic violence under the NDP prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic has certainly exacerbated that. The rate of family violence against children has increased 41% in 2019 over the previous year. BC had the largest provincial increase in Canada, with a 25% increase in the rate of family violence. 2019, police reported family violence against seniors increased by 20% for the 4th consecutive year. But notwithstanding this, Madam Speaker, the Provincial Office of Domestic Violence no longer exists under the NDP government. It was transferred from the Ministry of Children and Families to Public Safety and Solicitor General in 2018, and then it was dropped altogether from being mentioned in any budget from 2019 onwards. We need a comprehensive action plan for domestic violence. The Say Something campaign against domestic violence was discontinued. So, yes, Madam Speaker, I support the member's motion that this House commit to advancing the rights of girls, trans, and gender-diverse people and building an inclusive province for all. But, Madam Speaker, we need urgent action on these issues to ensure a safe and inclusive province for all. This government has the tools and should make it happen. Thank you,
Member. Recognizing the member for Victoria Beacon Hill.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I also rise in support of the motion today. With the number of comments, though, I have to say I'm nearly speechless at some of the accusations and some of the words already shared. As Parliamentary Secretary for Gender Equity, I work across government to make sure that the rights of women and girls to safety, to success, to economic independence, and a life of their own choosing is protected. To work with my colleagues to make sure that two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people are treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve, something our government is committed to. Whether in the Environmental Assessment Office, where we fundamentally changed the process for resource development projects to require a look at the social impacts on community, or to health, where we've made it easier to access gender-affirming care, or by moving sexual assault service funding from precarious grants to dedicated funding. And we have work to do. We have work to do after a government that eliminated funding for 37 women's centres, reduced childcare supports for families, and slashed legal aid for survivors of domestic violence. And I know, Madam Speaker, that the members opposite have already talked about pay transparency. I'll remind them that it was their party, with their current leader was Minister for Deregulation, that scrapped pay equity legislation. And that we have work to do to consult with employers, labor, with advocates, with First Nations, with Indigenous leaderships, and those are conversations that we are having to get this right. And more to the point, Madam Speaker, I'm waiting for a time when this commitment to addressing the gendered and racialized pay gap transforms into support for raising the minimum wage, scrapping the server wage, ensuring that people disproportionately racialized women who work in healthcare, critical jobs of health and housing and housekeeping, have fair wages and job security. I'm looking forward to a time when an interest in closing the wage gap becomes support for funding for targeted opportunities in tech and trades, investing in affordable childcare, and wage enhancements for early childhood educators. I'll let the members opposite know that that gap is starting to close because it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. But, Madam Speaker, it is pretty easy to get caught in the dance that we do here. And of course, the reason I know all of us are here is for the people in our communities, for the people who need us to get it right. This summer and fall, I had a chance to hear directly from community. To a member opposite who insisted there was no action being taken, in Kitimat, I joined the Tamatag Status of Women for groundbreaking on 44 units of housing, 12 transition beds, 12 units of second stage housing, and 20 units of permanent affordable housing. Tamatag told me how desperately this is needed because they have turned away women staying in unsafe homes. In Terrace, I visited the Kasayan Society, who with our emergency sexual assault funding has developed 24/7 response to survivors of sexualized violence in their community, a new service. They attend hospital, police reporting, they provide emotional support, system navigation, and much more. That is real action in defense of the rights of women, girls, two-spirit, non-binary, the rights of all people to safety. In Prince George, I visited the Sexual Assault Center. Funded by our government, they've built a police interview room. It means that survivors can make police reports in trauma-informed ways. I visited the Native Court Worker and Counseling Association, who have a new Indigenous Victim Service program to support survivors navigating this system. In Prince George, 55 new, safe, and affordable homes, from transition to second stage to townhome rentals. I visited the Howe Sound Women's Center to learn about their brand new 24/7 sexual assault support. In addition to being available for emotional support via text and phone, Madam Speaker, since they started, they've supported 12 survivors accessing healthcare and forensic exams. People who otherwise would not have had access to this service or would have had to do it alone. These programs, these homes, these supports, they exist because this government believes in a province for everyone, believes in the right to safety and to healing, and we believe in the rights of survivors and the value of community care. So we invest in frontline service and community organization. We invest in support. We invest in survivors and families. We invest in their healing. I'll put this record up against the other side any day.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Caribou North.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I rise today in support of this motion to advance the rights of women, girls, transgender, diverse, and two-spirited people to build an inclusive province for everyone. Safety is one of the most fundamental needs of human existence. Yet every single day, the physical, emotional, and mental safety of individuals is stripped away in the very places that people should feel the most secure. Gender-based violence is the type of abuse that women, girls, trans, non-binary, and two-spirited people are at the highest risk of experiencing. It can take physical and emotional forms and can happen in relationships and at work. Anyone can be abused, but women, girls, and gender diverse are at high risk due to the additional discrimination and barriers that they face. While we speak about advancing the rights of all individuals in British Columbia, it's critical that we stand up and not only call out this significant issue in our society, but we need to work together every single day to bring an end to sexualized violence in our communities. Sexual violence is a systemic issue. While anyone can experience it, individuals from marginalized communities do so at disproportionate rates. A 2019 study from Statistics Canada found 1 in 10 female students were sexually assaulted in post-secondary settings in that year alone. The study also revealed that more than 70% of students at Canadian post-secondary institutions either experience or witness sexualized violence. This is an astonishing number and should make all of us stop and think about the true volume of students that represents. If anything, this must encourage all of us to do more in sexual assault prevention. It's clear that a new comprehensive action plan is necessary to tackle the different forms of gender-based violence that our communities face every single day. Unfortunately, we've seen some troubling decisions by this government. Not only have annual reports been neglected, but the Provincial Office of Domestic Violence does not even exist anymore. After being transferred to the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General, it was dropped from even being mentioned in budget documents from 2019 onwards. Women's transition housing, that was promised by this NDP government, yet only 10% of the promised units are open today, leaving many to wonder how long it will take until the rest are ready. This is a complex issue. I certainly understand that, and the plan must be in-depth and tackle different areas where people are vulnerable. This includes safe housing, legal aid, agencies, and other programs such as educating younger people about on-campus and domestic violence. It's important to ensure policies are in place that call for increased funding to address sexualized and gender-based violence on campuses. Over the past 4 years at UBC alone, visits to their sexual support programs have increased by nearly 300%. The result is that the school is absolutely stretched to their limits and has even had to ask students for a fee increase to cover these costs. If we're going to tackle meaningful action and put in place the types of supports we need in post-secondary institutions, and we know that we've seen an increase in sexualized violence during the pandemic, then real steps are going to be needed, and they're needed now. I applaud the many organizations that are helping people in community and throughout British Columbia, and will continue to be an advocate for the necessary policies to aid them in their work. We must shine a light and work towards creating change. We must continue to stand up with our communities. We need to listen, and we need to support those in need. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Burnaby North.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise in favour of the motion, be it resolved that this House commit to advancing the rights of women, girls, trans, gender diverse and two-spirit people and building an inclusive province for all. I represent BC on the steering committee of the Canadian branch of the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians, the CWP. And I'm going to talk about why it's so important to democracy that our legislature is made up of members who mirror the rich diversity of our province, to reflect on the barriers to equity-deserving groups entering politics and characteristics of the political environment that may be driving them out, and to share some of the steps we are taking in BC and in other jurisdictions to make legislatures more welcoming to those whose lived experiences may not be considered normal in this environment, who may still feel like outsiders. To quote from the executive summary of the report on gender and diversity sensitivity at the Legislative Assembly of BC, commissioned by the CWP in 2020, in the words of the author, Dr. Jeanette Ash, Canada is celebrated as one of the most diverse countries in the world, yet, although women were first elected to Canada's national and provincial legislatures approximately 100 years ago, it took until the 1980s for women's representation to hit double digits, and even longer for the first Indigenous, Black, or openly lesbian women to secure seats. Recent elections have created the most diverse legislatures, but these bodies still do not closely mirror Canada's demographic profile. As the report states, Canada's legislatures are overwhelmingly comprised of white male elites, and their working practices continue to reflect the traditions and preferences of members who have historically populated it. With women comprising 29% of members of Parliament, Canada ranks 53rd of 193 countries, placing it well below other established democracies. When taken as a whole, women hold 34% of all provincial and territorial legislative seats. So what, you may be thinking? Doesn't the world have bigger, more existential problems to solve, like the climate crisis, like the rise of fascism? I would argue that that is exactly why we should be addressing gender and diversity representation in this institution. Studies show that more diverse and inclusive parliaments tend to be more effective and legitimate institutions. Decisions reflect a more expansive set of interests, concerns, and issues. Diverse parliaments tend to be more trusted by their electorate. The politics of presence matters for reasons of justice and for legitimacy. So, Madam Speaker, the more diverse the legislative body, the more that body is likely to pass legislation that advances the rights of equity-deserving groups and to build an inclusive society for all. Counting matters. We need diversity data to track changes in who and who is not present. But as I've learned working with Dr. Ash, substantive representation also matters. Not only do we need to be asking ourselves how many women and other equity-deserving groups are present in the legislature, we need to be asking if they are proportionally represented in positions that influence outcomes. I'm proud that our Premier created a cabinet that is 50% women. So much more needs to be done to adequately assess substantive representation. Power imbalances can be invisible and subtle. That is why the CWP is embarking on a comprehensive gender sensitivity audit that asks such questions as, Are women and other equity-deserving groups proportionally represented in parliamentary leadership positions? Do the standing orders, codes of conduct, and dress codes reveal evidence of organized masculinism? What are the informal norms and conventions, and do they tend to be exclusive? And are there formal supports for parents with young families? Does the legislature have a plan for supporting and protecting legislators who may be vulnerable to violence and abuse because of their identity? Speaker, that's just a small sample of the kinds of questions that go into developing a plan to ensure this environment is welcoming to everyone. To conclude, critical to committing to the advancement of the rights of women, girls, transgender, diverse, and two-spirit people, and building an inclusive province for all, as this motion urges this House to do, is a commitment to taking a hard look at how we operate here.
Thank you, member.
Democracy
if you would take
may
your
depend
seat,
on
please.
it. Thank you.
Recognizing the member for Peace River South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I know a few people have read this, but I want to start by actually reading the motion back into the record again today, brought forward by the member from Chilliwack-Kent. Be it resolved that the House commit to advancing the rights of women, girls, trans, gender, diverse, and two-spirited people, and building an inclusive province for all. This morning when I was reading that motion, I thought, this is a great opportunity. I was kind of surprised that it was coming up at this portion, but I thought this is a great opportunity. This is somewhere where we can all agree. I'm looking for somebody to put up their hand in this House that said, I hope I get elected so I can make things worse for people in the province of British Columbia. I don't think anybody in this House did that. I sure hope not. What surprised me with this motion was not so much the wording in the text of that motion itself, but the commentary that I'm hearing in the House. I think anybody watching this right now at home would be absolutely just shaking their heads and appalled. When I heard the member from Chilliwack-Kent, and she did a very good job putting this forward and brought forward some of the commentary, working with school districts and the ARC Foundation and others, I thought this is great. This is something we can all support. This is something we can all get around collectively, and we can all not politicize such an important issue. Until the very last few words that had to target and politicize it, and that is absolutely unfortunate that I'm hearing that in the House here today. This is actually, well, now I'm getting heckled. That goes to the interesting point. I did hear the whole thing, and it's unfortunate when it gets to the very end, though, that we have to try to politicize on the actions. So, I do find this interesting, Madam Speaker, again, because we're talking about something where we've had an opportunity to collectively work together. Is this an issue? Absolutely. Is it getting worse? Absolutely. Which is why this is a perfect opportunity where all sides of the House can work together to try to solve an issue, which is why in 2016, the BC Liberals, we brought forward and changed the Human Rights Code. That we brought forward, working with the ARC Foundation, the school districts, the independent schools around the province, that we were the ones that brought that forward because we recognized that this needed to be dealt with. Now, it's unfortunate that the NDP are trying to politicize that, Madam Speaker, but it was an opportunity, I think, where actually all sides of the House could have agreed that we could work together. There's been opportunity to have bills in front of this House that I guarantee you would pass unanimously if the NDP brought them forward, because they'd be the right things to do, the right things to help women, the right things to help our youth, the right things to help people in the province of British Columbia. You know, we look at the promises that this government's made. It's one thing to make promises. It's another to deliver on those promises. And I guarantee you, those promises that you've made to help people, if you actually brought forward meaningful actions, they would be supported, because that's what's needed. Not politicizing such an important issue. I want to thank, actually, the NDP members that were around in 2015, 16, and 17 when this side of the House brought those bills forward, when we brought those changes forward to help children, to help youth, and to help people in the province. Why? Because at that time, they did not politicize it. At that time, they supported it. And I want to thank the NDP because they recognize there are times we can work together to help women and children in the province of British Columbia. It's unfortunate today that that seems to have digressed into a political narrative that's not helping the cause. So, Madam Speaker, I think we need to get back to the grassroots of what we're trying to do in this House, and that's help people. And that's working together to support the issues. That's why when I saw this motion this morning, I was excited to stand up and hopefully not have to politicize an issue. I was hoping to hear we were going to work together to help the people and the women and people part of our LGBTQ community in the province who right now, who are struggling, who are being marginalized, who are being victimized. And there's opportunities that we can actually work together to help them. I want to thank the school districts, all the public and private operations in the province who are helping our kids, who brought forward the proper guidance mechanisms to help the students, to help the teachers, and help all of the people in the province. That has gone a long way. I want to help the ARC Foundation, or I thank the ARC Foundation and others too. They've been scrutinized and criticized, but they've persevered, and our students are benefiting because of it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Richmond South Centre.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I want to start by thanking and expressing my full support to the MLA for Chilliwack-Kent for introducing the bill that be resolved that the House commit to advance the rights of women, girls, transgender diverse and two-spirited people, and building an inclusive province for all. I would like to start my speech on a positive note. Recently, my family welcomed a brand new addition to my family. My son was born in early September this year. His arrival brought joy and unfortunately stress to our family. With 2 under 2, my wife and I have had to replan everything in our life to support both children. It is an overwhelming challenge that taxes every aspect of our lives to the limit. The reality is, my wife and I are both lucky and privileged. We both have strong careers to pursue and loving extended families supporting from the sideline. Yet for many other families, it is a Herculean effort that demands unwavering sacrifice from at least one of the 2 parents. Frequently, the sacrificial responsibilities falls onto the mother. It is exponentially more difficult for single mothers to balance personal life and childcare. Childcare is one of the most challenging barriers for equity today. That's why I'm thrilled about Childcare BC plan. Since 2018, our government has invested over $2.4 billion to build an affordable, accessible, high-quality, I've turned 2 pages at the same time, childcare system to ensure that families, especially women, can participate in the workforce, advance their education, pursue a career, and most of all, define a life balance on options and preferences, not on limitations, inequality due to gender. And as a Richmond Child Care Service recipient, I too am deeply grateful for the investment. Although there's much more work to do, our provincial government has accomplished much in the child care front. I know many young Richmond South Centre families look forward to affordable, accessible, and high-quality child care to provide much-needed relief so they can thrive here in BC as well. Before I was honored by constituents of Richmond South Centre to serve as an MLA, I had the privilege to work as a community resource navigator for BC 211. However, calls involve individuals trying to flee domestic violence were truly heartbreaking to handle. Callers often experience multiple forms of abuse: physical, verbal, emotional, sexual, and financial. Many of which callers endure for extensive period of time before they find the courage to reach out. Financial dependency, societal shame, child separation, emotional blackmail, threats of violence, and legal status are all reasons why many individuals tolerate abuse and delay reaching out for help. When a caller finally finds the courage to reach out, the most heartbreaking answer I hate to provide from time to time is the transition house in your area is full. I'm glad our provincial government takes gender-based violence seriously. Tens of thousands of people who are experiencing or have experienced gender-based violence are getting counseling and other assistance they need through the over 400 victim services and violence against women programs across BC. We introduced paid leave for people facing domestic and sexual violence and job training specifically for survivors of violence and abuse. $100,000 for more than a bystander campaign to support violence prevention program. $10 million provided to End Violence Association of BC to support emergency sexual assault services. In our 2022 budget, we're providing core funding to more than 50 sexual assault services undoing cuts that were made to these critical services in 2002. We put survivors first. BC Women's Transition House Fund provides $734 million over the next 10 years to build 1,500 new transition homes for women fleeing violence. There's more work to do, and our provincial government is committed to end gender-based violence. On a positive note, we're working to build a province where everyone can thrive. I'm glad our government is expanding women's access to education and training in STEM through programs and funding, including a $250,000 grant to Achieving Anything Foundation. We're also expanding opportunities under the new community benefit agreements so that women, youth, and Indigenous people will have access to employment, training, apprenticeship opportunities on major infrastructure projects. Furthermore, closing the gender gap is extremely important, which is why we're moving forward with a commitment to introduce to a pay transparency legislation. Our government is committed to support our equality, equity, and justice for all. British Columbia. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Surrey White Rock.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do stand with pride to support the motion put forward by the member from Chilliwack-Kent. Today, if it's not failing me, is October 3rd, and tomorrow is October 4th, which is my son Nicholas's birthday. And I wasn't in my notes, but I just reminded myself that, you know, the pride that we had as a family, as Nicholas, we have an organization called Sources, which is throughout the province, but at Sources, they have a transition house for women fleeing domestic violence. And on Nicholas's 5th birthday, he decided that he wanted his birthday funds to go to Sources. So him and his mom and his sister went there and they presented the money, and he's got a certificate that proudly sits in his room. But to this day, there is still a donation called Nicholas's Birthday Fund at Sources, which you can go to and donate, which we will be doing as a family to provide that level of services in our community of Surrey White Rock. So it was timely that I spoke on this, with tomorrow being Nick's birthday. But as we reflect on today's motion of advancing inclusivity, it's by its definition of the practice of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might normally be excluded or marginalized. This, we can all agree, must be a priority for all members of this legislature, which I know it is. As each one of us today stand together in raising awareness and pledging action, we must work to break barriers for marginalized communities in BC, especially women, girls, transgender, diverse, and two-spirit people. Whether it be in the workplace, schools, or other institutions in our communities, women and gender-diverse people play a pivotal role in shaping our province and deserve respect and equal opportunity. It is truly remarkable the impacts that they have made in our province. In the face of systemic gender biases, women in BC continue to fight discrimination, challenge stereotypes, while paving the way for future generations of leaders. And it brings me to this. I can't help but also take a moment today to recognize a new MLA that will be serving in the community next to my own. The new member for Surrey South has been recognized as a champion of human rights and has been an advisor on matters related to gender, sexual orientation, equity, and inclusivity. And in 2019, she even published a book in tribute to her uncle, a victim of Canada's LGBT purge, with all proceeds going to children, Nunavut, and residential school survivors. I know I'm not the only member today who's excited to welcome the new MLA for Surrey South and to have her incredible lived experience shared in this legislature, which will happen later on this afternoon. But while we reflect on the important contributions gender-diverse individuals have made, there is much more to be done. As critic for mental health and addictions, I can't help but think of the disproportionate impact that bullying, harassment, and violence have on women and gender-diverse people. Violence against women is not only a woman's issue, it's everyone's issue. It affects entire communities as the trauma ripples through families, schools, workplaces, and homes. We can no longer be bystanders We must continue to push for actions that will prevent violence against women, such as ensuring employment supports, helping those fleeing violent situations, and securing access to healthcare resources for counseling and mental health services. Now, our previous government tabled a report called Addressing Violence Against Women in British Columbia. The report detailed the steps the province needs to take to help prevent violence against women, and we need to continue to build on that work to ensure the right supports are available in communities across BC. Part of taking action is ensuring that the most at-risk groups, such as Indigenous women, women of color, women with disabilities, have the right supports they need, such as culturally relevant education, mental health resources, and so much more. We all have a role to play in preventing violence before it starts, responding to violence when it happens, and rebuilding from its devastating effects and impacts. Violence prevention, though it is perhaps the most challenging and critical element of the task ahead, is one we all need to focus on. In closing, let's work together to ensure everyone in British Columbia that needs access to mental health resources, whether it's a child facing loneliness or a woman facing domestic violence, that there is a system of care in place to help in the moment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Nelson Creston.
Thank you, Speaker. I would like to enthusiastically speak in favor of this motion. First of all, as we come back to the House, I really felt the weight and the privilege of being able to voice my thoughts in the Legislature. And I would like to thank the people of Nelson Creston for the enormous honour and privilege of being elected to serve and represent you here in Victoria. When the Legislature was built, it was built by men and for men. Between 1891 and 1914, 16 women's suffrage bills were introduced and defeated in BC's Legislative Assembly. Some women in BC had been permitted to vote in municipal elections since 1873, but there was a growing sentiment among many that women's votes and voices were needed on the provincial stage, both as a matter of justice and also as a means of influencing the policies of the day. What a novel concept. In 1916, a referendum was held and resulted in 66% of the men who voted were in favor of extending the rights of women to both vote and hold provincial office. By 1918, a by-election was held in the provincial riding of Vancouver City, and Mary Ellen Smith became the first woman elected to BC's Legislative Assembly. Many people believed that securing the right to vote and be elected to public office would bring about needed improvements in women's and children's social and economic conditions. But in spite of this growing momentum, BC's suffragists were still predominantly white and middle class. In fact, the suffrage movement was marked by its remoteness from other groups in the province, notably First Nations and Asian women. Many suffragists view these women as potential beneficiaries of a progressive social agenda rather than political allies and equals. Today, I am proud to be part of the most diverse government in BC's history. We have come a long way, but there is still more work to do. Representation matters. Reflecting on the events of this past week, I think about my rights as a woman in stark contrast to Masa Amin, the 22-year-old Kurdish-Iranian woman who died last month after being detained by the Islamic Republic's morality police. Over the weekend, we saw people from across the globe demonstrate, rally in solidarity of Iranian protesters. I stand here today in solidarity with them. I'm so grateful that as a woman in British Columbia, I have the rights and freedoms that I do, but we have still so much more work to do to cultivate an inclusive province. Gender equity means people of all genders and gender expressions are treated fairly and have the same opportunities, and we must always use an intersectional lens. I would like to thank my colleagues, parliamentary secretaries for gender equity, anti-racism initiatives, and accessibility for the work they do each and every day to build an inclusive province and advance the rights of all British Columbians. Indigenous women, women of color, immigrant women, two-spirit and non-binary people, transgender people, and women with disabilities are disproportionately experience gender-based harassment, violence, and discrimination. And too many of us in BC are still making less than men. To ensure government policies, programs, and services are working for all British Columbians, we must understand different ways that people experience the world. The Gender-Based Analysis Plus is a tool our government uses to help understand how diverse groups of people experience public policy and where changes should be made. GBA is making a difference in the choices we're making. We're investing in better wages for people, providing important services such as long-term care and childcare. We're increasing the minimum wage. We're restoring dedicated funding for emergency sexual assault response services. We're speeding up investments in internet connectivity in rural and remote communities. We are updating language in government regulations and legislation to reduce barriers for people in accessing services and to ensure more people see themselves reflected. And we're working on pay transparency. We have also been increasing women's representation in leadership positions. Women now make up over 49% of public sector board membership in British Columbia, up from 41% in 2017. Representation matters. In conclusion, I would like to thank all of the people across the province who have been committed to advancing the rights of women, girls, transgender, gender diverse, and two-spirit people, and building an inclusive province for all. Everyone has the right to feel safe, respected, and included in their home and community. Our government is committed to helping people achieve what they need to be successful every day in everything we do. Thank you, Speaker.
Member. Move adjournment of the debate, please.
Now, noting the hour, I move adjournment of the debate.
Member, you heard the motion. All those in favor indicate aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. Acting Government House Leader.
I move the House to now adjourn.
Member, you heard the motion. All those in favor indicate aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. This House stands adjourned until 1:30 this afternoon.